How you doing, everybody? Welcome to another edition of Jay's Retro Toys and Games for Wednesday, April 6, 2022. Episode 9 coming at you right now with a great toy that, in times of trouble, when you needed a hero, and right now we're in, as you know, the Ukraine war and everything else going on with what's going on out there. We try to keep positive outlook and everything with the show here. We need a figure. We need an action figure, which we're going to be talking about. We need a figure that stands for truth, justice, and captures all of the things that a real American hero would do. And, what we're talking about is an American media franchise and a line of action figures owned and produced by the toy company Hasbro. Hasbro's been around such a long time. They seem to pick up everybody's leftovers and make it just something really great. The initial product offering represented four of the branches of the U.S. Armed Forces, with the action soldier of the Army, the action sailor of the Navy, the action pilot of the Air Force, the Marine of the Marine Corps, and later on the action nurse. And the name is derived from the usage of this name for the generic U.S. soldier itself, derived from the moral term G.I. Joe. That's right. We're talking about G.I. Joe that started in 1964. That's right. It was not an 80s toy, folks. Big in the 80s, yes, but didn't start out till 1964. We're going to look at that right now, right here on Jay's Retro Toys and Games. Welcome everybody to the show, and everybody out there in YouTube, and of course Spotify, wherever you are. I hope you're having a great time, a great day. This is Wednesday, April 6th, and we are live here and ready to go for another edition of Jay's Retro Toys and Games. Looking today at the great American hero, the doll that basically stood for action figure. Yes, G.I. Joe. The G.I. Joe trademark has been used by Hasbro for several different toy lines, and although only two have been successful. The original 12-inch line, introduced on February 2nd, 1964, centered on realistic action figures. And then in the United Kingdom, this line was licensed to Palitoy and known as Action Man. Then in 1982, the line was relaunched in a 3.75-inch scale, complete with vehicles, playsets, and a complex background story involving an ongoing struggle between the G.I. Joe team and the evil Cobra organization, which seeks to take over the free world through terrorism. As the American line evolved into the Real American Hero series, as we all know, Action Man also changed by using the same molds and being renamed as Action Force. And although the members of the G.I. Joe team are not superheroes, they all had expertise in areas such as martial arts, weapons, and explosives. G.I. Joe was inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame at the Strong in Rochester, New York in 2004, and into the Pop Culture Hall of Fame just 5 years ago in 2017. Now we're going to look at the history of those 12-inch figures, those big action ones. The original idea for the action figure that would become G.I. Joe was developed in 1963 by Stanley Weston. He was the inventor. He was a Manhattan licensing agent, and Weston made rudimentary prototypes of the figure and basic marketing materials that showed the sales potential of a military action figure. When he showed these materials to Donald Levine, a Hasbro executive, Levine told Weston, "You will make a fortune with these." Weston subsequently licensed the entire concept to Hasbro for $100,000. Now, the conventional marketing wisdom of the early 60s was that boys would not play with dolls and parents would not buy their sons dolls, which have been traditionally a girl's toy. Thus, the word doll was never used by Hasbro or anyone involved in the development or marketing of G.I. Joe. The action figure was the only acceptable term and has since become the generic description for any possible doll intended for boys. That's right, action figure for boys, dolls for girls. America's movable fighting man. It's a registered trademark of Hasbro and was prominently displayed on every boxed figure package. The Hasbro prototypes were originally named Rocky for the Marine soldier, Skip the sailor, and Ace pilot before the more universal name G.I. Joe was adopted. One of the prototypes would later sell in a heritage auction in 2003 for $200,000, $1, and an African-American figure was introduced in 1965, though it was simply the same face as the white figure painted brown. Now, aside from the obvious trademarking on the right buttock and other aspects of the figure were copyrighted features that allowed Hasbro to successfully pursue cases against producers of cheap imitations, since the human figure itself cannot be copyrighted or trademarked. The scar on the right cheek was one. Another, unintentional at first, was the placement of the right thumbnail on the underside of the thumb. These early trademarking with G.I. Joe was used through some point in 1965. The markings changed once G.I. Joe was a registered trademark. G.I. Joe now appears on the first line. Subsequently, the stamp trademarking was altered after the patent was granted in late '66 and assigned a number 3,277,602. That was the patent. Figures with this marking would have entered the retail market during 1967. Now, by the late 60s, in the wake of the Vietnam War, Hasbro sought to downplay the war theme that had initially defined G.I. Joe. The line became known as The Adventures of G.I. Joe. Then in 1970, Hasbro settled on the name Adventure Team. Highlights of the line included, to coincide with the new direction, lifelike, flocked hair and beard, an innovation developed in England by Palitoy for their licensed version of Joe the Action Man, and is introduced in 1970. A retooled African-American adventurer was also introduced, which came in two versions, as did the others in the series, bearded or shaven. 1974, named after the increasingly popular martial art, Hasbro introduced Kung Fu Grip to the G.I. Joe line. This was another innovation that had been developed in the UK for Action Man. The hands were molded in a softer plastic that allowed the fingers to grip objects in a more lifelike fashion. The polymer used, however, broke down quickly, which caused the end of the thumb and fingertips to break off after a few weeks. Serendipitously, the deformed appendage bore a distinct resemblance to the Bao Zua hand-striking technique, and play went on. Then in 1976, G.I. Joe was given an eagle eye vision, a movable eye mechanism to allow the toy to appear to be looking around when a lever in the back of the head was moved. This would be the last major innovation for the original line of 12-inch figures. Now, for its first 10 years, G.I. Joe was a generic soldier adventurer with only the slightest hints of a team concept existing. Then in 1975, after a failed bid to purchase the toy rights to the $6 Million Man, Hasbro issued a Bionic Warrior figure, Mike Power, the Atomic Man. 1 million units were sold. Also added to the adventure team was the superhero Bullet Man, and this character had recurring enemies: the Intruders, strong men from another world, and comics included with figures at the time featured Eagle Eye, Joe, the Atomic Man, and Bullet Man operating together. The adventure team was finally an actual team. The original 12-inch G.I. Joe line ended in America in 1976. At this time, Hasbro released a line of inexpensive, rotationally molded mannequins in the G.I. Joe style called the Defenders. Now, from 1966 through 1984, Palitoy Ltd. produced a British version of the 12-inch G.I. Joe line under the Action Man name for the UK market. Initially, these were exactly the same designs as the American figures, and at first the same military theme, which included figures from World War II. The line later expanded to include all men of action, like football players and other sports figures. In the early 80s, Palitoy responded to failing sales of Action Man by launching Action Force, which was a new range of smaller military-themed figures in the style of the then-popular Star Wars line from Kenner. Later, when the U.S. Real American Hero line was released in the UK, They were released under the Action Force title since the term GI is not in common use in Britain. Now, the figures had the same appearance and code names as the American G.I. Joes, but their identities and histories were international rather than purely American or British. The range was later renamed G.I. Joe to bring it into line with international markets. However, the Action Man line retained its original name when it was revived in the early 90s. The G.I. Joe line was also licensed to Germany under the Action Team name, and in Spain, Jiperman was the Hasbro licensee, although the products were more based on Palitoy's line down to the logo design. And in France, the name was Action Joe. In Japan, Takara and Tuscado, or Tuscoda, licensed the figures under the names G.I. Joe and Combat Man. In Italy, Polistil licensed the figures under the Action team name. In Australia, the line was released as G.I. Joe by Ken Bright. Palitoy also licensed their Action Man line to Toll Toys. In Brazil, it was licensed to Brinquedos Estrela. The 12-inch line was called Falcon, and the 3 and 3/4-inch figures were called Commandos M. Acao, or Commandos in Action. In Argentina, they were licensed by Verily Enterprises under the name Joe Super Temerario and Los Temerarios. The G.I. Joe toy line was produced in India under the Fun School brand. Mexico, G.I. Joe was licensed to Lily Letty and were named Hombres de Acción, or the Men in Action. Now, jump to 1991 and 94. Hasbro begins releasing new 12-inch G.I. Joe figures in 91. The first figure, Duke, was marked exclusively to Target retail stores. Based on the Real American Hero toy line, the Hall of Fame series featured mission gear outfits, vehicles, and featured popular characters like Snake Eyes, Stalker, Gung Ho, Cobra Commander, Destro, and Storm Shadow, among others. This was followed by an anniversary series based on the 1960s line and was followed by the Hall of Fame limited editions also based on 60s releases. Now, G.I. Janes, going now to the Classic Collection, they were introduced in a series called the Classic Collection, the first 12-inch female dolls in the G.I. Joe lineup since 67. This doll was a helicopter pilot. The Classic Collection harkened back to the original all-military theme of G.I. Joe with fairly realistic uniforms and gear. Soldiers from Australia, Britain, and other nations, as well as United States forces, were featured. The line also presented a all-new articulated G.I. Joe figure that formed the basis of many offerings until the 12-inch line was discontinued in the new millennium. 2000, a Navajo Code Talker was introduced, only one of two 12-inch G.I. Joe talking figures until this time since the 1970s. In 01, G.I. Joe honored the events of the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor by releasing a line of Pearl Harbor figures. 2003, Hasbro announced the release of the 40th anniversary G.I. Joe line. This line featured reproductions of the earliest G.I. Joe figures and accessories originally made in 1964. Now, in November of 2006, a reproduction Land Adventurer G.I. Joe figure was released as an exclusive to Hot Topic stores. The figure was a reproduction of the Land Adventurer with the Kung Fu grip and came in the coffin-style box. A reproduction Talking Adventure Team Commander was also released in a limited run of 1,970 issues. Then in 1997, the original G.I. Joe figure returned via the G.I. Joe Masterpiece Edition, a unique book and figure product created by Chronicle Books with assistance from Don Levine, former creative director of Hasbro Toys, and the driving force behind the original Joe concept. During the late 1990s, Hasbro built on the renewed interest in authentic reproductions of G.I. Joe established by the Masterpiece Edition reproduction book figure set, and they bought the rights to the ME figure and released a range of store-exclusive reproduction figure sets with the character of the 60s G.I. Joe box sets. Now, let's fast forward, go back a little bit, to the history of the 3 and 3/4-inch figures. So they shrunk. They started big, and they came down. The year, 1982, saw the highly successful relaunch of the G.I. Joe product line in a smaller 3 3/4-inch scale. This scale was the same scale used by Kenner's Star Wars figures, but with many more points of articulation, much like the 1970s Megos Micronauts toy line, which itself was licensed directly from Takara's Micromen toy line. This relaunch pioneered several tactics in toy marketing, combining traditional advertising with an animated television miniseries and an ongoing comic book. The decision to use a smaller 3 3/4-inch scale for the figures also made it possible for Hasbro to produce a variety of matching vehicles and playsets that further expanded the appeal and commercial potential of the line. Now, G.I. Joe's increasing popularity supported an array of spin-off merchandising that included posters, T-shirts, video games, board games, and kites. In 1985, both Toy and Lamp and Hobby World magazines ranked G.I. Joe as the top-selling American toy. This 3 3/4-inch line was canceled at the end of '94. This was also the 30th anniversary of G.I. Joe accordingly. And Hasbro released a series of 12-inch and 3 3/4-inch figures based on the original Action Team figures from 1964. A select assortment of figures from the Real American Hero line was released as Toys R Us exclusives to celebrate the 15th anniversary. A second assortment followed in 1998. Then in 2000, Hasbro re-released a selection of 3 3/4-inch G.I. Joe figures and vehicles. This line lasted until 2002, and the figures were sold in packs of 2 and consisted of repainted versions of figures from the Real American Hero line. Now, some of these repainted figures were assigned new identities. For example, the Baroness figure was repainted and sold as a new character called Chameleon, described on the packaging as the illegitimate half-sister of Baroness. Now, go to 2002 to 2005, G.I. Joe vs. Cobra. Beginning in 2002, newly designed collections of the 3 3/4-inch G.I. Joe figures and vehicles were released. Each collection centered on a storyline or theme, such as Spy Troops and Valor vs. Venom. Direct-to-DVD features were animated for both the G.I. Joe Spy Troops and G.I. Joe Valor vs. Venom collections, as well as a new trading card game based on the G.I. Joe vs. Cobra storyline. Both the 12-inch and 3 3/4-inch lines were put on hiatus prior to the release of the Sigma 6 line in 2005. The 3 3/4-inch line was reintroduced after a very brief hiatus via Hasbro's direct-to-consumer website, HasbroToyShop.com, and various online retailers. And as a result of the line's success, some figures also became available at certain retailers such as Toys R Us. To commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Real American Hero line in 2007, Hasbro released a collection of newly sculpted 4-inch figures as opposed to the 3 3/4-inch scale of the Real American Hero line, based on classic and new designs of many of the line's best known and most popular characters. The 25th anniversary figures replaced the classic O-ring construction with a swivel chest feature and increased points of articulation beyond the standard shoulder, elbow, and knees to swivel wrists, ankles, and double-hinged knees. Now, the 25th anniversary figures also included Specialist Tracker, otherwise known as Matt Tracker, the leader of Mask. Originally planned to consist of only 2 sets of 5 figures each, 1 G.I. Joe and 1 Cobra, the 25th anniversary collection was well received by retailers and collectors and was expanded by Hasbro into a full-fledged toy line that ran through 2009. The most recent releases in this line do not include the 25th anniversary branding, but in all other respects constitute a continuation of the 25th anniversary collection. Other waves released in 2009 included the Resolute figures, which were introduced in Wave 13 and had an animated feature premiere in April of 2009. The 25th anniversary line was later canceled in favor of releasing figures for the upcoming live-action movie. Now, some of the planned figures from canceled waves, totaling 14 figures, were instead released as 2 7-figure exclusive packs entitled Defense of Cobra Island and Attack on Cobra Island. Each set contained figures from one opposing side. The canceled future waves included Night Force Falcon, the Python Patrol Trooper, and Televiper, and an Iron Claw Resolute Crimson Guard Trooper comic pack. Then in July of 2009, a series of figures based on the G.I. Joe The Rise of Cobra movie was released in the United States and Australia. The line was a mixture of the Rise of Cobra movie designs, some G.I. Joe versus Cobra designs, and some 25th anniversary figure molds and new molds. You get the hint. 2010, a new series of figures was released based on 4 battlegrounds: desert, city, jungle, and Arctic. The packaging was an update to the 25th anniversary design. Now to 2011, a new series of figures was released, including characters from both G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, and the G.I. Joe Renegades cartoon series. This series was continued through 2012. That's the 30th anniversary. Retaliation, series of figures based on the movie G.I. Joe Retaliation, was confirmed by Hasbro in February 2012, despite the movie's release being moved from June 2012 to March 2013. The initial assortment of figures, vehicles, and role-play items were shipped to retailers and appeared on store shelves in May of 2012. A Variety article was published stating that the already released figures had been pulled from the shelves and recalled by Hasbro. Although the company's official statement indicated that existing product would be sold through, new product shipments were halted by Hasbro, but existing Retaliation figures were available in Target, Walmart, and Toys R Us as late as December 2012. The toy line was re-released in the United States in February of 2013. Then in 2014, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of G.I. Joe, a new line of figures was released using characters from the G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero cartoon series, and this series ended in 2016. Focus now 2 years later, 2020, Hasbro released a new line of super articulated figures and vehicles, similar to the Star Wars The Vintage Collection, utilizing retro-themed packaging from the 1980s. Then it goes into some storylines, short-lived lines, Sigma 6, the Sideshow collectibles. You've seen it all. Real people honored, And then in the comics, you had all those good ones, records and read-along sets, film. This was all in media. Then in television, of course, really launched the toy line. And then, of course, they had the video games. And a whole list goes on. So there you have it, folks. 50 years of G.I. Joe, and it continues to be one of the most popular action figure line for boys that I would think that if you had it, you got some money if you ever think about selling any of your stuff, because they're going to be worth some money later on down the line as the vintage stuff continues to be more popular and collectors are looking around for probably some really good vintage deals. You could probably make some money on eBay if you really wanted to, or for that matter, Amazon, and sell them outright. Whatever you decide to do, you know about G.I. Joe, and you know that the Real American Hero will always be there no matter what. Next time on the show, we're going to look at a game that I think is a very imperative game to life itself. Yes, the game of life. We've all played it in some way, shape, or form. We're going to go back and look at the history of that on episode 10 of Jay's Retro Toys and Games, coming up on this Friday's edition. We'll see you then. For now, have a great night. Bye-bye.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Derived Network for great more content like this one.